Good evening. I am Saidiya Hartman, and it is an honor to introduce Jamaica Kincaid, who was generous enough to send an introduction for this evening's reading. Jamaica Kincaid has written a bunch of things and now teaches at Claremont McKenna College and lives, alphabetically speaking, in California and Vermont. But I plan to say a little more than this. Jamaica Kincaid is a writer whom I had admired and idolized for decades, a writer who has taught me to read and to think, and whose novels and nonfiction force us to acknowledge the brutal history that is our inheritance, to countenance the obscenity and the poetry of an imposed language, the English of the master and the criminal that has by default become our mother tongue, to love, hate, vandalize, and remake the colonial library, and to admit what can't be refused, that our dispossession has lasted so long. The beauty, economy, and precision of Kincaid's prose transports even the most curmudgeonly and aloof reader into the abject state of gushy fandom. And like Annie and Lucy and Zuela, for whom the lesson of love is always one of abandonment, betrayal, and ambivalence, so too the reader seduced by the gorgeousness of Kincaid's language and lulled by its rhythms must also experience the injury of history, the pain of misrecognition in a world that allows for no true consciousness of the self, and the eclipse of the what if and what could be, only to find oneself again in the long march of the defeated. What to call the thing that happened to me and all who look like me, Kincaid asks in her garden book. Should I call it history? If so, what should history mean to someone like me? Should it be an idea? Should it be an open wound, and each breath I take in and expel, healing and opening the wound again and again, over and over? Or is it a moment that began in 1492 and has come to no end yet? Reading Annie John, Lucy, Autobiography of My Mother, and Mr. Potter is to experience the longue durée of 1492 and to acquire first-hand knowledge of the injury of history through the pricks and lashes delivered to the reader by the sharp-tongued irony and eviscerating intellect of these fictive and serial autobiographies. To enter the world of Kincaid's novel is to reckon with the psychic and affective legacies of violence and conquest, to dwell in the black hole of history, to reside in the small place that is the colony, a place that for centuries has been imagined by explorers, colonizers, and tourists as Eden. The intimacy of beauty and violence is nowhere more apparent than in the garden, where a linden tree or a daffodil is as life-threatening as a knife, and the taxonomies of classification that describe flora and fauna also name and identify man and his others, humans and races. History hurts. Kincaid teaches us this again and again, never by obliging us to remember past atrocities or by explicitly revisiting dominant historical accounts or episodes, but through stories of love and loss that attend to the psychological and emotional contours of subjection that force us to rethink the relation of past and present and to question if there are still slaves and masters. Kincaid delights in not delivering the happy ending. In the place of closure, her novels provide ironic affirmations of the human, or pictures of still and arrested life, or beginnings where we would expect conclusions. Too late, we realize that what if, or what should be, is as close to paradise, to love, to mother, as will come, and the only promise of equality made good is that everyone, everywhere succumbs eventually to the overwhelming stillness of death. Like adolescents risking the perils of the sea to meet the enchanting Jablis only to drown before reaching her, we too will never reach the lovely figure beckoning in the distance, see the face of the lost mother, experience the look that is the gift of love, recover our origins, or be healed by an apology, and wishing otherwise only makes the wound hurt more. What makes all of this bearable is the exquisite prose and the reckless and defiant girls determined to exist and to find pleasure in a world in which they are disposable because they are not boys, not men, not ladies, not European, but who nonetheless love their noses, their unruly hair, the too fat lips that form their mouths, the smell of their armpits, and touching themselves. For Annie, Zuela, and Lucy, giving an account of the self requires first and foremost a struggle with the colonial episteme that makes virtually impossible any knowledge of their existence. To produce a narrative of one's life, an autobiography, requires a rebellion against the norms that negate and dismiss you. To come of age in Kincaid's fiction is to produce an account of the self. My name is Annie John. So begins the concluding chapter of the eponymous novel, the concluding paragraph of Lucy. At the top of the page, I wrote my full name, Lucy Josephine Potter. At the sight of it, many thoughts rushed through me, but I could only write down this: I wish I could love someone so much that I would die from it. And then, as I looked at this sentence, a great wave of shame came over me, and I wept and wept so much that the tears fell on the page and caused all the words to become one big blur. And Zuela's reflections: this account is an account of the person who was never allowed to be, and an account of the person I did not allow myself to become. When the I seeks to give an account of itself, writes Judith Butler, an account that must include the necessary conditions of its own emergence, it must, as a matter of necessity, become a social theorist, and as well, I would add, a historian. The Bildungsroman, the coming-of-age story and narrative of development in Kincaid's hands, becomes nothing less than a history of the making of Western modernity as it is experienced by the defeated and the disappeared, schoolgirls happy to see the great man Columbus in chains, neglected rebellious daughters finding perfection sitting on the tombstones of long-dead people who had been masters of their ancestors, and unloved girls who, like mythic devouring mothers, choose violence as a way of displaying their capacity to create and their need to love. If this sounds brutal or like the Tempest retold from the raging mouth of Sycorax, then rest assured it is. This is the terrible beauty, the promise and the peril into which Jamaica Kincaid invites us. Please let us welcome Jamaica Kincaid.
Well, thank you so very much. I feel you should go home now. I don't see how I could possibly say anything, and in fact, I'm going to read something completely new, and I think at the end of it, you'll just have to take back everything you say, because it... because everything that is to come has the distinct possibility of nullifying everything that has been. So I hope this doesn't make you revise your wonderful opinion of what I've written so far. I'm going to read something new. I think it's beginning to assemble itself into a novel. It's called, the title of it is this is the title. It is called See Now Then, and the idea of it, the mechanics of it is that the word then functions as the present and the past and the future. So whenever you are directed to see then, you have to pay attention, because it might be the past, it might be the present, and might be the future. And that's the only direction the narrator gives. The narrator is a mother. I'll try to center you in it. And her name is Mrs. Sweet, and she's married to Mr. Sweet, and they have two children, Heracles and Persephone, and they live in a house that is called the Shirley Jackson House. And you can imagine that they live in a small village in Vermont. From time to time they say they live in a small village in Vermont. So I shall read parts of it. parts that when I was reading today, this afternoon, gave me pleasure, so I picked those parts. But the trouble with my writing in regard to me is that I don't always like it. So if I liked it this afternoon, doesn't mean I like it right now, and I may read it differently. I may read it as if I don't like it, but when I chose it, I really, really liked it. Finally, I can have things just the way I want them, said Mr. Sweet out loud. He was all alone in the parlor of Shirley Jackson's old house. The house had a parlor, or a room called the parlor, though Mr. Sweet does not know if Shirley Jackson called it the parlor when she lived in this house. In the parlor, all the furniture was made from some very dark wood, and everything else, curtains, cushions, all the other furnishings were in very dark colors. I like this, said Mr. Sweet loudly still, louder than ever before. He spoke so loudly that he could no longer hear the sounds from outside, Heracles playing golf, or basketball, or shooting some imaginary beast, or enjoying the blood flowing through his boy veins. I shall kill that kid, thought Mr. Sweet. A set of fugues danced around inside Mr. Sweet's head. Mr. Sweet tried to hum them. He could not do so. Mr. Sweet tried to whistle them. He could not do so. Mr. Sweet lay down on the dark sofa, locked in the dark room, enjoying the fugues revolving loop-like inside his head. Whack, followed by the whoosh sound of the small white ball moving swiftly through the air. Agh, was the sound coming from Heracles' throat. As he watched the golf ball he had just hit sail through the air without impediment. The blood gurgled through Heracles' young boy veins freely and loudly at that, so loudly that it brought an end to the eternity of B-sharps, those very ones that lived inside Mr. Sweet's head. Looking out the window from inside the parlor, Mr. Sweet could see Heracles at ease with golf ball, basketball, balls of every kind, the parlor so dark, so dead, the world of balls of every kind, so brilliant and vital, so brimming over with vitality. Inside the parlor, outside the parlor. This wearied Mr. Sweet, and he then fell asleep. Mr. Sweet's sleep was a relief to him, but he could not know this or see this, not then, not now, not ever at all. And then awake, upstairs above him, he could hear Mrs. Sweet mending the socks, all those socks with holes in them. How did they get holes in them? Who wore them to begin with? Mending. Mr. Sweet could hear her mending, not see her, only hear her, for she mends so loudly. She mends so loudly, he said to himself, and inside his head those words were interrupted, Those words interrupted the round of fugues. 5 fugues they were, each one hewing closely to the prescribed form, each one different from the other, each exhausting itself to its end, then, next, taking its place, and so on and so on. But nothing takes the place of the fugues, only they are interrupted from time to time by a string of words she meant so loudly. Simple enough from time to time took the form of a paralysis-inducing potion. Oh, look at now, what is there to see? And oh, look at now, and what is there to see? To see then Mr. Sweet, a very small boy in short pants and shirt, bounding across the green grass of a lawn, selling in a boyish way water flavored with lemon juice and water to friends of his parents, sitting in a chair and listening to jazz, eating peaches that had been poached in pineapple juice, speaking authoritatively of being and not being, traversing the island that was Manhattan, and at that time not being able to see at all the house in which Shirley Jackson lived, the house in which he would live with the fugues trapped in his head, Heracles murdered over and over again, and seeing him come alive again and again, Mrs. Sweet mending the endless number of socks over and over again, the short pants and shirt being replaced by the moleskin of a brown corduroy suit. Closing his eyes, he is now sitting at that ancient instrument, the harp, wrestling with that large triangle and holding its steady against his small manly breast, wrestling with a diminishing pitch here, a lengthening string there, gut in the middle, wire below, the flats and sharps, the majors and minors key, harmonic systems, double melodies, polyphony, monodies, melismata in the plain song, the contrapuntal forms, allegri, concertos, not yet the nocturne, not now that, but the ballad, oh yes, all that flooded over Mr. Sweet as he sat before his ancient instrument, the harp, worshipping and worshipping its holiness, causing him to grow weak. He was so young, not yet Mr. Sweet, and yet he was always Mr. Sweet, as even he himself could see, now, then. Oh, but this is the voice of the monodist, and with the ancient instrument, Mr. Sweet is on a stage all alone. The podium has even been moved to the side. The auditorium is full of chairs, but no audience, and this pleases the young Mr. Sweet. Young and full size he is then, not old, and the size of a mole as he is now, and he plays the ancient instrument with joy and love and earthly vigor, so much vigor, and breaks all the strings on the ancient instrument from which now, right now, at this very moment, comes no music at all. But then the auditorium is full of chairs, but no people, and no one at all, and tugging on the strings of the ancient instrument with his strings made of gut and wire, Mr. Sweet plays a song, for he is not yet a theorist, and he plays a song, a concrete song full of harmonies and melodies, and so simple anyone could sing it. Even Heracles, just after Mr. Sweet has beheaded him, could sing that song. The Beheading of Heracles was a title Mr. Sweet gave to all the music he played on the ancient instrument. Then, Sweet Night for Heracles is the name Mr. Sweet gives to the name of all the music he played on the ancient instrument then, now. And at the end of each suite or sonata, for the young Mr. Sweet plays everything in every way, each kind then was the same, there being no audience to make a distinction, chairs are indifferent, came a deafening silence, applause, yes, silence all the same, and immortal to empty chairs was Mr. Sweet then, but he was a boy with all those things hammering against the inside of his head, notes and notes of music, arranging themselves into every known form, but never into forms not yet known. And this was the word Mrs. Sweet heard, that poor dear woman mending socks upstairs. It was the voice of the monodist, her poor dear Mr. Sweet. Whack came a sound from Heracles as he made a putt, a basket and a score, and yet was on the par. His head, free of his body but not of his entrails, filled up the empty chairs in the auditorium of Mr. Sweet's useful recital. Not that, cried the young Mr. Sweet, and he made the chairs empty again. The strings of the harp, gut and wire, broke, and he bent down and over to make the instrument well again. So ancient was this instrument. The Shirley Jackson house was not known to him then. Never did he imagine then, his youth was his now, that he would live in such a house, so big, full of empty spaces that were never used, never filled up, even in the imagination, a parlor with dark furniture meant for no use at all, the young Heracles with his endless task of fitting balls, large and small, into holes of all sizes, the young Heracles growing in youth, not growing older, growing in his youth, becoming more perfectly youthful, his many tasks to perform, performing them more perfectly, at first performing them awkwardly, not right at all, but then becoming so good he could place any ball of any size in any hole, no matter its width or depth or height. Thwack was a sound caused by the quick movement of Heracles' hand sweeping a ball through the teeming air. Whack was the sound of his head sliced away from his body. Oh was the sound that came out of the mouth of the monodist, Mr. Sweet, as he saw Heracles picking his head off the floor and replace it on his neck, which was just above his shoulders, with such deftness as if he was born to do only that, keep his head in that place that was just above his shoulders. All that day and all that night, as the very thing called time collapsed within itself, and events also, for when it came to that, not even events could distinguish itself. Mrs. Sweet mended socks, and while doing so could see everything, especially the things that had never entered her mind. She mended away at the socks, repairing the holes, sometimes making just ordinary stitches, sometimes making a Christmas tree and a Santa Claus in the colors red and green to fill the holes, eventually undoing those to finally fill the holes with six-pointed stars and biblical scrolls in blue and white. Mr. Sweet hated this. How he hated this, the six-pointed stars and the biblical scrolls in blue and white, the sight of it making him swear that he would be a deathbed Catholic. Whatever could that mean, thought Mrs. Sweet, for she so loved Mr. Sweet and thought always that his contradictions were a source of laughter. Whatever could that be or mean, a deathbed Catholic, at the same time fully aware, knowing that to please God was to welcome annihilation. But Mrs. Sweet loved Mr. Sweet without blinds. Here then the young Heracles, still innocent of the notions of honor and glory. "Dad," he said, "do you want to go bowling?" But Mr. Sweet could see the bowling alley. It had in it people who had eaten more than they should, and this very thing was a badge of honor, and they spoke loudly and would die of diseases that were curable. They would never die of natural age. But what would that be? For to die is natural. But time, that collection of events saturated with feelings and smells and the way someone remembered them and the way anything felt like, and the sounds and someone experiencing the relation between sound and time and even space. Oh, said Mr. Sweet, do we have to? Do we have to? And he could see all the people in the bowling alley throwing bowling balls with accuracy and finding satisfaction in that, and throwing bowling balls in a carefree manner and find equal satisfaction in that. And he hated those people, for none of them knew of adagio and B-flats and symphonies and boogie-woogie and all of that. They only knew of the joy of the large wooden ball knocking down wooden men in the lanes. "Dad, do you want to go bowling?" said Heracles to Mr. Sweet, and Mr. Sweet said, "Yes, bowl you out of existence." But Heracles skipped away to the car and did not hear his father say those words. Just before they entered the bowling alley, Mr. Sweet fell and broke the bone in the smallest finger of his right hand, so could never again play on the pianoforte, a melody written by a German man in the middle of the 19th century. Mrs. Sweet stood still. She loved them both so much, the young Heracles. Her husband, Mr. Sweet, dressed up in the brown corduroy suit which hugged his body so closely he looked like a mole. The young Heracles now bends down to pick up his toy myrmidon, a gift he received in his Happy Meal that Mrs. Sweet had bought for him at McDonald's. The myrmidons, tiny figures in blue and green and red plastic. They clasped their shields to their breast and held their spears aloft, always ready to strike out and inflict pain, imaginary death. When Heracles was 4 and 5 and 6, he used to line them up against each other on the stairs just outside his room, battlefields, and these plastic figurines would demolish figments, brave figments, over and over again, and then would rest. So weary were they from the fighting, and then an unsuspecting and innocent Mrs. Sweet would step on their abandoned form, and sometimes almost break her neck tumbling down the stairs from that encounter. "Oh shit," she would say, and then look quickly around, her eyes darting here and there quickly, as if controlled by a mechanical contraption. The little bastard, the little shit. But she loved Heracles and took him to McDonald's to buy his Happy Meals, even when she was unhappy, and did not know that she was so, happiness being the sphere of Heracles and his father and her daughter and the myrmidons, made of plastic or not, and everything else as it came up in the Shirley Jackson house. The toy myrmidons were sometimes lined up, set up in formations, ready to do battle with and triumph over a set of adversaries whom Heracles could not see but neither could the toy myrmidons. And so it all went in this way, a way that would please Heracles now, then or now, being one, and the same burden or pleasure. At other times the toy myrmidons were separated from each other, scattered here and there on the floor of the room. Heracles slept in all by himself, in the bin of the dirty clothes, and then rescued from the wash cycle of the washing machine by Mrs. Sweet, on the stairs where Mr. Sweet was walking down just after he got out of bed on a beautiful morning, slipped and broke his vertebra. The vertebra healed, but Mr. Sweet himself did not. Heracles said, "Sorry, Dad," as he always did, and to say sorry was like oxygen to him. It needed no explanation. Sagging into "Sorry, Dad," and sagging into everything that was now, which would eventually become then. To all that Heracles had strong feelings, but the strong feelings would be dealt with then, not now, never now. But the many toy myrmidons, the result of the many trips to McDonald's restaurants to purchase many Happy Meals, were lined up, and they did not go into battle with some imaginary foes, and they triumphed, of course, again. And they did go into battle with some imaginary foes, and they triumphed, of course, again and again. They triumphed, of course, and the imaginary battlefield was covered with blood, sheer blood, so much of it covering everything. So Heracles thought, or said to himself, and imagined it also. The Myrmidons' rule is another thing he said, or imagined, and then he fell asleep. Wake up," his sister shouted at him, for he did have a sister, and she had curly hair. "Wake up," his sister shouted at him. "A snake with 9 heads is lying next to you in your crib." And the very young Heracles then turned over into somersault, and facing the 9-headed snake directly, stuck out his tongue at them. Without making too much of an effort, he tore off the heads and threw them over his shoulder, all 9 of them, and they landed on the floor of Mrs. Sweet's newly cleaned kitchen. "Oh God," she said to herself, "that kid is always up to something. What a mess he has made now." And she picked up the 9 snake heads and put them in a bag, wiped up the floor clean, and she asked Mr. Sweet to please come and put out the garbage. Sorry. Oh, the silence that descended on the household, the sweet household as it lived in the Shirley Jackson house, on poor Heracles, who paused for a very long time at the top of those stairs, on his sister as she curled up in her bed and went to sleep like a bean seed planted into the rich soil of a treasured vegetable garden. Mr. Sweet removed his fingers from the strings of the lyre on the dear Mrs. Sweet, who froze over her mending, the darning needle in her hand, just about to pierce the heel of a worn-out sock. And then gathering up herself, surveying what lay in front of her, Mrs. Sweet sorted among the many pairs of socks she had been mending over and over again, and removing a pair, she fashioned a new set of organs for her beloved Mr. Sweet, trying and succeeding in making them look identical to the complete... Oh, I'm sorry. I should read you something that this makes sense to. But Mr. Sweet was in the parlor where he always liked to be. It was not a funeral parlor. It's only that he was in mourning and conducting a funeral for his life, the one he had never led. And Mrs. Sweet, calling him, interrupted this morning. She was always interrupting his life or his death. She was always interrupting. The parlor was dark, but not completely. Everything could be seen clearly, but as a shadow of itself. How Mr. Sweet liked that, everything a shadow of itself. But there was that voice of Mrs. Sweet, not the shadow of a voice. She was not capable of that, a whisper conveying her deepest feelings with a glance, or just outright stop breathing. Just stop, right now. Mr. Sweet, she would say at the top of her voice sounding louder than a town crier, louder than a warning of impending disaster. She was so loud, Mrs. Sweet was so loud. "Mr. Sweet, can you please take the garbage out?" Slap, slap came the sound of his feet as he dragged them across the floor, and when he was with the garbage that Mrs. Sweet wanted him to take out, his rage was so great that it almost brought the nine now dead snakeheads back to life. In any case, his rage was such that it caused his chest to rip open, and his heart exploded into pieces. But Mrs. Sweet, so used to mending socks, applied her skills to this task, and soon had Mr. Sweet all back together, his heart in one piece inside, stitched back together in his chest. "That little jerk almost killed me," said Mr. Sweet to himself, "and it's not the last time," he said again to himself. And he was reminded of that time, not so long ago, when he was coming down the stairs, and Heracles was going up the same stairs, and they met in the middle, and by accident collided, and by accident Heracles, to steady himself from his collision, grabbed Mr. Sweet's entire testicles and threw them away, and he threw them with such force that they landed all the way in the Atlantic Ocean, which was then, and is so now, hundreds of miles away. The testicles then fell into that great body of water, but did not produce typhoons or tidal waves or hurricanes or volcanic eruptions or unexpected landslides of unbelievable proportions or anything at all noteworthy. They only fell and fell quietly into the fathoms of that lightless water and were never heard from again. Oh, the silence that descended on the whole household, the sweet household as it lived in the Shirley Jackson house, on poor Heracles, who paused for a very long time at the top of those stairs, as his sister, as she curled up in her bed and went to sleep like a bean seed planted into the rich soil of a treasured vegetable garden. Mr. Sweet removed his fingers from the strings of the lyre. On the dear Mrs. Sweet, who froze over her mending, the darning needle in her hand, just about to pierce the heel of a worn-out sock. And then gathering up herself, surveying what lay in front of her, Mrs. Sweet sorted out among the many pairs of socks she had been mending over and over again, and removing a pair, she fashioned a new set of organs for her beloved Mr. Sweet, trying and succeeding in making them look identical to the complete set of testicles that had belonged to him and destroyed accidentally by his son, the young Heracles. And when Mr. Sweet fell into a sweet sleep of despair, after not knowing what to do regarding his lost testicles, Mrs. Sweet sewed the mended socks into their place, the heel of the socks imitating that vulnerable sack of liquid and solid matter that had been Mr. Sweet's testicles. But then, oh yes, then, the beautiful brown hands of the beautiful and dear Mrs. Sweet had turned an unhappy white, all bony and dry. The rest of her remained her beautiful brown, a brown that glistened and shone, a brown so unique to her. No other Mrs. Sweet could ever be brown in that way, so glistening, so shiny, so glowing, making her sometimes seem as if she were a secret form of communication. A point of light colliding with the tip of her ear might signify something, might be a signal that enormous changes should be set in motion, or the morning light briefly coming through the window that was just above the kitchen sink, and for a moment landed on the flat point that was the tip of Mrs. Sweet's flat nose, as she stood there drawing water to make breakfast coffee. The light would then cause such a flash that it could have been taken as a warning against impending cataclysms. And another section. That afternoon, at 3:45, the young Heracles got off the school bus and found that his mother, the dear Mrs. Sweet, was not waiting to pick him up. He saw the school bus driven by the madly named Mr. Strange disappear around the corner below the Bennington Monument. He saw his companions, some wayward boys who lived in a village that was surrounded by evergreens of every kind except for broadleaf, and the evergreens were all sick with a blight of rust. And these boys were very bad, for sometimes they pummeled almost to death the young Heracles, and the force required to restrain himself from gathering them up all together in his large brown hands and making them as lifeless as his old socks was greater than the force he had used to smite an entire city of Thebes, as it appeared in his handheld Nintendo game. Those boys, in any case, had names of no distinguished origins, their names being Jamie, Kaylin, Rainier, Tim, Russell, and Matt. But the bus stop was empty of Mrs. Sweet, and the young Heracles was beside himself with anxiety and sorrow, for he loved his mother so and only so, and a dark cloud full of a toxic fire emerged from his forehead, and he directed it towards the top of the Bennington Monument and caused it to fall to the ground, just missing a bus full of citizens from Germany who were making a tour of New England in the spring. So beside himself was Heracles with anger and grief over Mrs. Sweet not being there to greet him when the school bus arrived, that he sank to the ground, drew his knees up to his chest, and rested his chin on them, so that he looked like an illustration of a fully developed child intact in his mother's womb, an illustration commonly found in the walls of a doctor's office. "Oh, come on," and that was the voice of the beautiful Persephone, his sister, and that is as it should be, for it was spring, and she was released from living in the depths of the pocket of Mr. Sweet's old Brooks Brothers tweed jacket. The lining of that pocket, which was made of silk purchased in Hong Kong, was shredded. Not knowing what else to do, she lifted him up with much ease, as if he were an ear of corn, or a pint of strawberries, or a plate of peas, or as if she were removing the hamster that died overnight from its cage, and she placed him in the right-hand pocket of her own jacket, which was made from polyethylene terephthalate, and the pocket itself was lined with rayon. Now, she said, as she stroked the curve of his back with her thumb, her forefingers shielding his head, which rested against his knees. "It is very bad that she's not here to meet us once again when we get off from the school bus. Where the hell could she be? What the hell could she be doing? Oh, she just sits in that room, writing about her goddamn mother, as if in the whole history of the world, people had never had a mother that wanted to kill them before they were born. And the stupid father named Mr. Potter, who couldn't even read, and the fucking stupid little island on which she was born, full of stupid people who history would be happy to forget, but she has to keep reminding everybody, and no one cares, and she can't stand it. And where is she? She's there in that little room off the kitchen, and from that same room she can see the kitchen, and she's making us whatever we all want to eat, and none of us want the same thing. And how she and how she manages to keep writing that shit. Make her stop before I kill her, for it was much better when she would only knit her stockings that were too big before they were washed, and then were too small after they were washed, and they had just gathered dust in the wash basket because she couldn't bear to throw them out after all the time she had spent knitting them, and the hats that never kept you warm. They fell into our eyes when we were skiing, and I almost killed myself coming down that Black Diamond wearing that stupid hat she had stayed up making for me as a present. And it is the stupid writing, that's keeping her from being on time to meet the school bus, which was driven by Mr. Strange. Ralph is his name too, and that is not a name with a distinguished lineage. And a man, just a man who should be locked up in jail in a cell that is underground, could come and pick us up and take us to his house and murder us, violate us sexually, and we would never be seen again or heard of again, not even to be mentioned on the nightly news, vanish from the face of the earth like a species from a geological era that isn't even detected yet. What is she doing? What the hell is she doing? She's sitting there in that room at the big desk that Donald made for her, and she's thinking of a sentence and the way it is to end. My mother would kill me if she got the chance. I would kill my mother if I had the courage. And as if such a thing was possible, she lives in that world of the room with the desk and the kitchen just beyond, and she leaves us here all alone for a man to murder us, for tourists from Germany to stare at us, for all the other children and their mothers to see that she doesn't love us. She only loves that world that she carries around in her head, a torrent of lies, all in her head. We are nothing to her, nothing, only those words in her head. And now look, the night is coming, the ink-black night is going to swallow us up, and we will never be found, for we will be lost then. in the night. Where is she? Where is she? Then, oh just then, Mrs. Sweet appeared in the old car, the old grey cuniclos, the old car Mrs. Sweet fondly called Mr. McGregor, for she so loved to personalize everything, as if everything in the whole world was made solely for her. And when she saw her two children, she blew up like a souffle, and actually right in her mind right then was the menu for dinner: crab souffle, a green leaf salad with a French vinaigrette, ice cream if the children wanted it from the store, not ice cream she had made herself. That she only did in the summer. She was very proud of them, and why, she couldn't say, not now, not then. But the children were glad to see her. Oh, so she thought then. His sister had released the young Heracles from her pocket the minute she caught sight of the old grey cuniclos as it crested the hill just in front of the Gatlin house. The young Heracles had unfolded himself from that eternal position, and now he looked fresh like a flower just opening, or like a flower just opening as seen in a time-lapse film. Mrs. Sweet gathered up her dear children in her arms and drew them close to her, with eyes closed, as if they were a fragrant bouquet of Lilium nepalens, just then picked. But really, though, she hustled them into the back of the old car, and there was mold growing on the floor. The roof of the car had a leak in it. The door on the driver's side did not close properly, letting in rain, or snow, as the case may be. In third gear, she turned onto Silk Road, crossed the Walloomsac River at the covered bridge, swiftly rounding the curves on the Madison Road, making a left on Harlan, and then home to the house in which Shirley Jackson had once lived. But that journey home then, what of it? What of it now? For Forest stands between the covered bridge and Shirley Jackson's house, and just as they approached it, Persephone wet her lips, and just as they crossed its boundary, she then burst into a song, not a song with everyday notes, not a song heard on the radio, and then again it was not even a real song. It was a series of pitch sounds, each of them different, and they came in rows of 12, or maybe 13 or 14, but 12 seemed more plausible, or so Mrs. Sweet thought, but she only thought this, she didn't know with certainty then or now, as she writes this. And those rows of notes that were the same and then were not, for the orderings were not expected, thought Mrs. Sweet, and that was when she didn't want to put a large man's athletic sock in the opening of the beautiful Persephone's mouth. And the orderings were random, thought Mrs. Sweet, and that was when she wanted to throw the beautiful Persephone into oblivion, an oblivion that was solely the heavens, a place where she would be held until Mrs. Sweet could bear her presence again. And the beautiful Persephone sang as if she were backed by an entire orchestra, a lavish one, as if she were in a great hall and an audience with no defining physical characteristics, no broad noses, no fine and yellow hair, and indifferent complexion, removed from historical events, were listening to her. But to the ears of the other occupants of the old Cuniclos, a car that was made in Germany but bore a great name, how annoying to hear the contents of the Delia catalogue in that way, how annoying to hear the contents of the Wet Seal catalogue in that way, how annoying to hear the contents of the beautiful Persephone's Desires in that way. She sang on, though sing, that act so associated often with the feeling of being transported out of your current state of mind into another realm, a realm of something other than our real selves, was not what the beautiful Persephone did. She sang. Her voice was beautiful. She sang of the tweed coat whose hem fell just below the knee, and the tweed coat that was cut in the style of a seaman in the British Navy, and of the dress that was made from barrels of oil that had been wrought into a fabric that looked like gossamer, and a dress of surreal beauty was fashioned from it. And she sang of the skirt that had wide pleats and was short, and the skirt that had narrow pleats that was long, and of boots that were thick-soled, and of boots that came up to the knee and was long, and the boots that could not even be considered wearing by the beautiful Persephone or her friend, the flame-haired lamb who lived on Mechanic Street, or her friend who lived on the ramparts of a mountain in North Adams, Massachusetts, or her many other friends who lived in the summer along with her in Camp Eisner, Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I think I'll stop there. Okay.
Yeah.
Incidentally, I like standing before this. I don't mind if you think I'm an engineer.
But I guess the first question I want to ask is what is the departure for you of this I mean, obviously the laughter and the humor is wonderful, and the children's vision of the work, but because in once, so I just want to hear you talk more about what the departure and the rupture is.
Well, let me see. I don't know that it's a departure. It's autobiographical. I only write autobiographical. I only write about myself. I only know. I only understand the world as I can filter it through my own experiences. So it's. I think if you ever get a chance to read it, if you would ever have a few moments in your life that were not so important and you wanted to read it, then you would see that it's not a departure at all. It's I only write about myself.
It's funny because as I was preparing my remarks, I was thinking that so many of the narratives are focalized through the perspective of the daughter. And I was thinking, but what about the mother? What about the mother? So it's interesting that there's the story now of Mrs. Sweet, who is both a writer and then involved in this kind of interminable, mundane domestic labor. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I eventually became a mother.
No, but you've been a mother. You've been a mother as you've written these other texts. But that mother, the mother, who is you, hasn't really, or if she has been, and the text has been in this kind of very displaced way, and less, visibly in the kind of autobiographical mode that one can track through.
Well, it is true that I am 60 years of age, and that it's perhaps a good time to try to understand what that might mean. I have 2 grown-up children, I suppose my childhood and the emotional wealth of that no longer seems either not available to me or not interesting.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that I would move on to borrow from the experience I've had in the past. But I think the hardest thing has been in writing this has been to understand how time works, and I'm not sure I do. I've been reading a lot of books about geology recently, and I've been trying to understand what it means millions and millions of years for something to happen, and people who understand it, who write about it, will just say, use a few words to say something dramatic. They'll say, well, 360 million years ago, the Atlantic Ocean was not there, the Sea of Tethys was something, and then this happened. And they'll say it in a few words, and so I try very hard to understand what that could mean. And one day I tried so hard to understand it. I really gave it some serious thought, and I thought I still can't understand it, but I think in the process I had rearranged the chemicals in my brain, because I had a kind of depression, but afterwards, but not really depressed. It just was something. I got out of it. I think the sediments got back to their usual order. But I was telling this to someone, a poet, and he said, "Oh, you don't understand. It's not sequential. You shouldn't try to understand it's sequential. You should understand that time it's all simultaneous." And I was very satisfied with that explanation for half a day, and then I decided really, and then I decided it was lazy, a lazy way to think of it. That it's simultaneous. It's sequential. I'm not that mystical to think it's simultaneous. I think it's sequential. It's hard to. So anyway, in trying to write about this, that the main character, I think, is not so much any of the four people mentioned in it, the two children and the husband and the wife, but actually I've been wrestling the most with characterizing time, how to put events in time and how not to, so that they don't date. I think I've sort of become suspicious of the notion of memory, but that's a whole other. Haven't resolved what I think about it yet, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as you speak, I guess, one of the questions I was going to ask is how does one continue to recreate one's life anew in serial, these kind of serial autobiographies, and then you, in some sense, you answered that with this new, with this different story that, also there was direct discourse, and there isn't a lot of direct discourse in your previous novels.
True.
So, and the laughter that was a part of that direct discourse. I don't know if you want to talk about that more.
I shouldn't talk about it too much because it's not complete.
Okay.
If I, it's not that if you know what will happen, you won't buy the book. That doesn't frighten me at all. But only that if I know exactly what happens, it will no longer interest me to put it down. And I don't know how it all works exactly yet, but it's near.
And see, I'm going to ask one more question about time, because originally I said, I'm going to ask one question, but now that I'm up here, I'm tempted to monopolize you. But I guess in terms of the relationship to time and all of your work, there's a way that you have I would describe it as a historical sensibility, but it's about a relation to time that's articulated on different registers.
Yes. Well, people like to say things are in the past, and I don't think there is any such thing. Not that it's all simultaneous, but that I don't think I don't believe in the past at all. I think that circumstances, make you want to put things aside. Life is so overwhelmingly big. It's big, so you might want to put some of it aside, but it's not the past. And I like history. I don't like it in the sense, but I suppose I like to know what happened, and I don't find an acknowledgement or a realization of what happened paralyzing at all. I find it the opposite of paralyzing. I find knowing makes me feel very much alive. It's sort of my drug is what happened. I like to know.
So, at this point, I think we should take some questions from the audience. All the way in the back.
Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Do you want to stand up or approach the mic? There's a mic over here on both sides. So actually, if people have questions, it would be great if they would just line up.
How does a story sound matter to you? And when can you tell if a story sounds right? How can you tell if a story sounds right?
In general or just my own? No, well, you said a story. I didn't know what you meant. Well, as I said when I started, it changes. It sounds right when I've let it go, and then sometimes I reread it and I think, oh, it doesn't sound right, and I understand people who rewrite an old story before they reissue it or something. I don't do that. I can see work of mine that I could make better, or I could do something else. But I would never do that. But in any case, it sounds right to me when I've released it, but that doesn't remain true. It's an ongoing thing. But I work hard at it, at getting it to do something that I'm satisfied with, and I put it down. I almost never rewrite because it would be a different thing if I rewrite it. But as I say, it doesn't remain the same. I don't know if that answers your question altogether.
That's great, but I was actually talking about the actual, the way the words sound when spoken out loud.
You mean when I'm reading it? Whether you
think about how it sounds out loud.
When I'm writing, no. When I'm writing, I'm not only conscious of what I'm doing. The idea that it would have a sound, it would have a life other than inside my head when I'm doing it. I'm not aware of that at all. When I read it out loud, all sorts of feelings. I have all sorts of feelings about it. I'm not going to change anything I read to you now, even though I can see I should have done this, could have done that, but it's finished.
But can I ask a follow-up question in terms of thinking about your writing and the way in which it's actually, in that regard, very different from many other Caribbean writers, in that the work can be so informed by the sound of language, right? Its sonic quality. When I think of your prose, I think of words on a page, that those words are so I don't know if you understand.
It's all that poetry I had to memorize as a child that really had a big influence on me. At the time, they were really big poems that I once had to, I've said this many times, I once had to copy books 1 and 2 of Paradise Lost, yes, as a punishment. And I was quite young, I was 7 years of age. But it's something like that would make me, and not only that, I had to do it, I did it in the dark mostly because we had no electric light, and the lamp light was very poor. It was, I think that I just sort of felt out the words, but I think that all of that, things like that, just had left an enormous impression on me. So the words are very and simple, mostly simple words, really, but for some reason I seem able to take a single syllable word and torture it to death until it yields up a meaning that the language had not intended it to. But I think that's it, that I was just given a lot of poetry, as a lot of it in form of punishment, and I sometimes think that in some way I am trying to remove the poetry and the poets of this work that was sort of like a lash. I'm trying to remove it from the world of punishment. I think I sort of use it in a I've sort of, not sort of, I love it. It's an expression of a kind of love. Nothing I like more than writing, and I really, actually the thing I like even more than writing is reading. But you're not really allowed to read the way I like to read unless you're writing. You can say, oh, I'm not really reading, I'm working.
There's a question. I thought I saw a hand in the back. Oh.
Yes, sir.
to
Thank
be
you.
here. And I had a question kind of for our young writers here. It's like my generation. So can you just describe how you feel like you've changed as a writer over the course of your career, or your biggest influences in terms of how you've grown?
I wouldn't be able to tell you that just because I am self-absorbed, but not in that way. So I wouldn't be able to tell you how I've changed. The influences on my writing are the ones that from my childhood, really. Charlotte Bronte and would be one, or Charlotte in particular. And then a lot of those, unfortunately, dead white men, though I feel sad for them because it's not their fault that they're dead or white. But a lot of it is almost no contemporary, really, because I didn't know 20th century. I wasn't familiar with 20th century literature until I was about 20 years or so. I didn't know that there was serious writing. I grew up in the British Empire, and so I read all up to Kipling, and Kipling wasn't considered real literature. It was just sort of entertaining when I was growing up. So those are the influences, the sort of British canon. I sort of had an education as if designed by people who went to Eton, I think, or places like that. They ran the British Empire, and they designed an education for us. And what they did was their work. They didn't think. I don't believe they think it would have any consequence what they were doing, and it turned out it did, because there are all these people who can write better than they can now. So, or whose writing is much more vital and interesting and important. And they sort of know it. I sort of like listening to someone like Martin Amis rant and rave about something every time he has a new book out. It's very entertaining. Yes?
Hi, I don't think I can stand like right in front of you, but...
Why not? Stand.
Okay. My name is Samantha Jackson. I'm part of both organizations that are co-sponsoring this, the Caribbean Student Association and the African Diaspora Literary Society. And for our spring break, the Caribbean Student Association decided to go to Jamaica for an international service trip. And what we really tried to tackle was, well, I'm the international outreach chairwoman for the organization, and I got in contact with the principal at the school in Jamaica. This is in St. Mary. And the reason why I bring up the Caribbean is really important, because I'm going to get to the point. But the principal was saying that a lot of the children, a lot of the work and what's in the curriculum was very Western focused, and it was very, I think it's like something that was, I guess, derivative of colonialism, but it was a lot of what the children were reading, and these are primary school children, were not works by Caribbean people. And so, as part of the Caribbean Student Association, we thought that was, okay, kind of problematic, because of children from the Caribbean, we feel like they should be aware of certain people, for example, like Marcus Garvey, and, you know, just people, not just the Western side of the world, but just be familiar with people in the Caribbean and the literature and their works. And so our idea was to get a whole bunch of books, because they didn't have a library at the school in St. Mary, Jamaica. And so our idea was to get a whole bunch of books and to furnish their library with books that were more particularly Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean centered. So they were like books written from Caribbean writers, African writers, and we wanted them to have more of a balanced education, because I believe in like education should be very inclusive. And I just wanted to ask, like, what do you think the effect of Western-focused curriculum or literature can have on people of color and how they look at Caribbean writers? What do you think about that?
By Western focus, what do you mean? Thucydides or Homer? Shakespeare?
For example, like colonial leaders, or maybe not having, I guess, something like Frantz Fanon, and this doesn't have to be for primary students, but not being able to be introduced to people people like that, or even for someone like Malcolm X, but like not having that other side, because learning about history is very important to just keep it in one box and not teach about other cultures. I think it's problematic, especially if you're looking through a history book or literature and the people that you're reading about don't even look like you. And so psychologically, I think it can have an effect on children. And even like at this university, children that are like college students that are like dealing with the core curriculum and a lot of things we can't really identify with. I think it's great having a very balanced education. I just want to know what
Well,
the effect could be.
Can I answer your question? Have you read Annie John?
Have
Have you read Annie John?
No.
There's a very wonderful scene in Annie John that's one of those encounters with colonial education that I think would be instructive. But you can answer. I just think it's interesting.
There are two things. I mean, the purpose of the education I received, which is what you're describing, was not. It wasn't meant to educate me. It was meant to turn me into a certain kind of person, which is a subject person. Now, a British person might say, well, all British people are subjects; they're not citizens. But since I wasn't British, I was West Indian. I would have preferred to be a citizen, and so there's that. That my education was not meant to make me participate in the Western tradition, and it had what you would call a very Western. How did you put it? Western focus. But an education, knowledge is knowledge. Knowledge is impartial. And, it's the uses or the way it's presented to you. I was presented with a British education, and the point of it was to tell me that, well, you can never really be British. The point of it was to lord something over me or to perpetuate a certain way of consciousness in our lives. On the other hand, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having an education. I shouldn't have been asked to memorize the kings of England. I shouldn't have. On the other hand, Richard III, Shakespeare's history plays are great. There are a lot of things that though I must say I did like knowing Alfred the Great burnt the cakes. I did like knowing that. And I did like the story of 1066 and so on. But to know about Marcus Garvey, he's not one of my favorites. Yes, you should know about the Haitian Revolution. You should know, the history of the West Indies. The history, one of the things that would be good for your a book you should include would be the journal of Christopher Columbus on his on discovering the West Indies. That every Caribbean child should read it in the original Spanish, or translated into French, English, because that is our beginning. We begin with the sentence that in the year 1492 is the way every West Indian child's narrative begins. So you should know that. But Christopher Columbus was a white man, so what do you do? And as for Fanon, they should know Fanon. Yes, they should, but no child can understand Fanon. But you might know of him. There might be a little placard. Oh, today is Frantz Fanon's birthday, and he introduced us a lot of things that are useful for us to know. It's just you have to be careful. Knowledge is impartial. The uses to which it's put is not impartial. It's something else. So it's really okay if you send them Shakespeare, or if you send them everything in the British canon up. Maybe not Kipling. Absolutely not Kipling. it's all right if they read. Well, it'd be wonderful for them to read Jane Eyre and to see the role that the that West Indian society played in a novel like that. That is, well, Jean Rhys wrote a novel that is you can call a prequel to Jane Eyre. It's wonderful to read Jane Austen, all of Jane Austen really, and to see that the off-stage story is the British Navy operating in the West Indies, that the British Navy was used to put an end to the slave trade. So it'd be wonderful to read Jane Eyre and someone pointing out to you, that lady, the headmistress, pointing out to her students that in between every line is a history of the British West Indies. But in particular, Jane Austen, to read Mansfield Park, that the entire novel is buttressed by West Indian slave society. So it would be interesting to find out how true that is. And so you read Jane Austen in another way. Really, you have when you want to talk about images of the self, or knowledge or about the self, or educating or education, you really have to be careful to separate it from bad motives. There is nothing wrong with the Western, in my view, with the Western canon. It's only the people who use the Western canon for nefarious or bad ends, and that if you are going to, I often find American students don't know an awful lot about American literature. For instance, none of them have hardly any of my students have read William Bartram, who's a great American writer and naturalist, and why? And they're white, and they haven't read. So they, what I want to really say to you is be careful. Giving someone a book on Marcus Garvey is not really a help, because he's a problem. He's a crook.
I guess I wanted to. Okay, I
But-
use Marcus Garvey, but.
But also, can I just intervene here? Because I just want to maybe, I think that there's a way that so much of of Kincaid's early work is precisely a kind of, pointed critique of the project of colonial education.
Yes.
I think that the colonial library of the great books, there's that love of the library and the regret that it's in the condition that it's in. But there is a critique of a certain kind of knowledge, right? So it's the knowledge of Linnaeus, right? Or the subject who asks, what is it that makes the world turn is different than Bronte and Austen.
Yeah.
So, but I think it would be very instructive to read.
I just
read
want to
those
tell
early
you
books.
one thing in my own life that I had to, I wandered lonely as a cloud. It's a vile thing that appears in Lucy, that I hate daffodils and so on. And then one day I realized that it wasn't Wordsworth's fault that I had to memorize a poem about a flower I might never have seen, or it wasn't that the hymn that says, "I long to see the white cliffs of Dover," that is such a popular hymn in Caribbean churches in when I was growing up, and that most of the people who sang it had no idea what cliffs were, white cliffs. And in any case, the white cliffs of Dover are not white at all. They're quite muddy looking. And but we adored them. We just would long to see this thing that we had never seen. How about, being asked to long for something you had never missed you had never desired in the first place? It wasn't lacking. The lack of Dover, we couldn't have it because we'd never known it. But on the other hand, it's a beautiful hymn, and so perhaps that's what might be a project for you and your fellow students: how to rescue these beautiful human expressions from horrible hands and horrible motives, I think. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to commend the young woman.
I'm sorry?
I would like to commend the young woman because I sort of understand what your attempt is. As a woman of your generation who also grew up in another culture, I fully understand. As a mother of young kids that are not young graduates, I would like to make you a little bit more comfortable. I also grew up in those circumstances, educated in such a way where actually mine is a Spanish background. And the accent of Mafeta, I grew up with ridiculous, it sounded ridiculous because we were told the Spanish sound of Mafeta. Being a black woman, it took me years to figure that whole thing out. To make you feel comfortable, I had a lot of advantages because of that. Today, my daughter, very much like you, is very much in tune of diaspora. And it's beautiful for both of us to sit down and I can read Joseph in Spanish and bring that advantage and read, a bunch of other writers in Spanish literature. And she can also read diaspora, and it's a very rich world. But I do respect for you because we need more of your mindset.
Thank you. Yes, and then the gentleman in back. Yes, what would you like to say?
Hi, my name is Ryan.
And speak so people can hear you.
I attend the Bronx High School, Bronx Finance, and so forth. And me, I recently met a girl. And I liked it personally, and I wanted to know where did you get the inspiration from? Because we had to do creative writing, something like it was like a run-on sentence, semicolons, and like the meaning.
She said she had a literary assignment where they had to read Girl and create a run-on sentence, recreate those colons.
A run-on sentence. Sometimes when I write sometimes when I send an email to my son, he'll say, Mom, stop being literary. You're being literary on me. It's just a run-on sentence. Girl was a story I wrote, very complicated. I was a young writer, a young woman starting to write, and I wrote for a magazine called The New Yorker. And at the time I was, I had some friends and they were there and we were young and we would make fun of the older writers, which now was just shameful. But it's something a younger writer should do. It's practically a commandment that you think that all the people who wrote before you were completely bad, and you just have to write so that if they're still alive and writing, they will read what you've written and stop right away. And I, at the time, would see all these writing that would show up in the magazine. I said, this is just so terrible. And so, especially the fiction I thought was terrible then, and I was completely wrong. And I thought, I am going to write things that when, and I won't tell you who they were, but it wasn't Donald Barthelme. I loved Donald Barthelme then, but there were some others. And I just thought, when they see this, they will say, my God, I'm going to sleep and stop writing forever. And that was my inspiration for Girl, was to write something so unusual that it would make the other people stop writing. It didn't work, thank God. But it was also a piece of writing that was the foundation for a set of things I would write, and as you can see, I continue to write in that way. I wanted to. Well, people always say, it has to have a beginning and a middle and an end, and I didn't believe that because I don't think a narrative really begins that way. That any true thing begins that way, that life doesn't begin in, it doesn't have a beginning and a middle and an end. It has you're born and you die, but that's not a beginning and that's not an end. So I wanted to do something that I thought really reflected, no, it didn't really. I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to live in a way that I didn't know other people lived. Is there?
There was someone in the very back.
Yes. Yes.
It was kind of starting to the question before about black narrative and
Black narrative?
the diaspora narrative.
Yeah.
But the idea of mythology and like looking at the Western canon, so much of it actually comes out of the idea of this continuity of history, but it's also very much based in what mythology is. Like this is a poem, but this is also history, but this is also myth, and it forms like this idea of who we are and how we locate ourselves. And then you see how it travels south to north, and then to countries that it didn't apply to, and then it kind of just jumps across the Atlantic, and then you have this new mythology that's being created. And in the black narrative, it's kind of like there's this stop at Africa, and then this new historical narrative that gets created. And my thought is that, and some other people I'm talking with, is that like the idea is that we kind of, a lot of our writing is kind of trying to answer the historical, purely historical documented story, but there's no mythology forming a sense of identity because there's that break. And I was just wondering, how do you how do I recreate, how would you recreate that? How would you think about, is it that we do a DNA test and find our lineage and then look at the stories and kind of reappropriate that into our culture now? Or do you, like, where do you begin? Or look at the Native American or the Arawak or Caribbean heritage that's in our blood and then kind of tie into the land there, because there's so much about land that informs the narrative. But, I mean, how would you approach that?
Well, you asking me? I mean, I think, but I mean, I just want to say, very simply that anything that is organic and natural isn't going to take what you're talking about, this sort of willfully looking at something and changing it, that doesn't have any, or the chances of that having any lasting power or any longevity is very small. But the thing that is organic, Wordsworth wasn't thinking, or Milton or Shakespeare, they weren't thinking, God, how am I going to get those black people to just be living on $1 a year for all of eternity? And Homer wasn't thinking that. I mean,
That's not what I meant. It's sorry, just to clarify.
Yes, please.
What I meant is that those stories form a European consciousness of self. So
They inform European consciousness, but the European consciousness is a human one, isn't it?
I'm not saying I'm not trying to disparage it.
No, I'm neither, and I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to say it's perfect or anything. I just think that it's not a useful way for someone going to write to look at it. It might be useful for a critic, but it's not useful for people making things to look at them from the view of Western or Eastern, or that a writer or an artist, you just grab everything. You're so lucky that you understand something. If you understand anything of the past, it doesn't matter whether it's European consciousness or Mars consciousness, just take it and make a use of it. I think that it's not a help. I mean, you should know that, at least I think, culture, this thing we call culture, it's flexible, it's plastic. People adapt, people take things and that they find useful. That's another thing about culture. The way it works is that people only take things that are useful, and then they transform them into something else, but they're not. I think the idea of the Western canon, you should leave that solely to Harold Bloom. Let him have it. Go right ahead with the Western canon. Let him construct it again and again, and then we will just move on, and he'll be all alone with the Western canon. But we must never have anything to say to such a ridiculous idea of the Western canon, or any canon. Just take whatever you can and run with it. I mean, it's just, you realize that the Western canon it doesn't just fall out of the Western sky, it's a melange of things too, and it's evolving. It's presented to us by an idiot like Mr. Bloom, who isn't always an idiot, but sometimes he is, as, the Western canon. But, and we will, we take of it what we can, and, really, the idea, and I think these concepts are useful, as I say, to an academic, but for someone doing something, the idea of the diaspora or the Western canon, it's not very useful to me to be living in the African diaspora, and I've always had a little bit of a problem with the diaspora idea. When I first came across it, I remember saying to someone, "I'm not really living in the diaspora; I'm living in America." But that's not a very popular view. But for writers, these words are restricting, living in the diaspora or the Western canon, and all of these concepts. If they were useful to define yourself, I think they no longer are. But
there was a question over here, Nick.
Yes, is there? Yes.
Hi, thank you both. I have a question about time. I think it's about time. I was struck by two things that you said, and one of them was Heracles' statement of "I'm sorry" to his father.
Yes.
And also.
Oh, I'm so glad you heard the piece.
And.
I'm very glad.
The sort of what I saw as the continued act of violence is against Mr. Sweet's body, particularly the dismembering and the throwing into the Atlantic.
Yes.
And I was wondering if I know you said you're thinking about time and how sort of bodies occupy the then, the now, and the future, and how you sort of see bodies and relationships sort of moving together through time, particularly Mr. Sweet and Heracles. And
yes, I'm going to leave that to you to answer, and I could answer it, but it will because I had a particular reason for putting it that way. The whole story, the whole body of the work is filled with violence of a domesticated kind, and it that particular losing the origin of it is when it happens in classical mythology. It forms a deity, but in this case it didn't. It had it makes a beautiful foam on the water, and yes, the goddess of love comes from, but in this case, no, it's a it would be interesting for you to read the whole thing. It may be an old-fashioned attack on the nuclear family, is what it might be. But the way time works in it is not. It's not so much that it works on the human body, but that all the wounds that occur are healed instantly in the story. Or no, no one really dies. They live again the way within a family, all the horror of it, one grows a skin. And actually one of the things that, the thing that one grows in a family, the skin one grows is the absence of memory or erasing the thing that happened. So that's one of the ways that time functions, is that the thing that has happened is instantly reversed. And then I think I must free you from...
So should this be the last question then?
Yes. Is that...
Do you want to... this person? Okay.
I'm a student at the writing division, fiction student at the writing division here, so I had a specific thing with respect to, maybe it's a craft question. Since you said your writing is a lot autobiographical, which kind of mine tends to be, about children and family, and a lot of, since you just mentioned about domesticity and violence, I noticed that your writing doesn't sound melodramatic. Is there a technique that you use to not bring that to the page and make it entertaining and artful, even though it's centered on autobiography and personal life and children and domesticity?
Well, if I knew that there was a technique that I could speak about, I would just simply put it in a bottle and market it or keep it all to myself, because it would make my life much easier. I don't know. I think, craft, people talk about craft. I don't think it can be taught, because the thing about writing and craft is that whatever you do in writing, and if it works, that's the craft. The writing itself creates its own craft. I don't think it has an independent craft. So I mean, it's not like making a table, or even like making an omelette. It's not like that at all. It just has its own dynamic. So when you can't write like another writer. You can only write, and you create I think you create your own rules, but there are only rules that you can follow. They seem to me, they can't be duplicated, apart from putting the verb in the right place, and the noun in the right place, and the adverbs, and so on, and the predicates, and the things that make up a sentence. Apart from that, I think, I think everyone will say, oh, don't begin a sentence with and, but I love to begin a sentence with and, the word and I think it's simply because people say not to do it is a reason to do it. So that would be that is my craft, is to simply do all the things I'm told you shouldn't do in a piece of writing.
So let us thank Jamaica Kincaid.
Thank you.